Imagine a scene at the port of Haifa, a critical strategic hub for Israel, and a frequent port of call for the American Navy's Sixth Fleet. Now, look closer at the massive new terminal, the one handling a huge chunk of the country's trade. Who built it and operates it? A state-owned Chinese company. For a moment, this looked like the pinnacle of a brilliant economic partnership. Israel got world-class infrastructure, and China secured a vital link in its global trade ambitions. It was a deal celebrated in both Tel Aviv and Beijing. But then the phone calls from Washington started. The quiet warnings from security officials grew louder. Suddenly, this symbol of global cooperation began to look like a massive security risk, a Trojan horse docked right where American warships refuel. How did these two countries, one a staunch U.S. ally and the other its chief rival, become so deeply intertwined in the first place? And how did it all start to unravel? That story of ambition, secret deals, and immense pressure reveals a geopolitical triangle you rarely hear about. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, to really get into this incredibly complex geopolitical tightrope Israel's walking. Balancing that absolutely essential strategic relationship with the United States, while at the same time chasing these huge economic and tech deals with China. We're digging deep today to understand this balancing act, especially when those business interests crash right into national security needs. We'll look at what pulled Israel towards China in the first place, the specific threats, and they are specific from Chinese investment in things like ports and technology, and how the U.S. eventually kind of forced Israel's hand on regulation.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is that this isn't your standard trade dispute story. It's a really stark example of how our whole idea of national security has shifted, in the 21st century.
How so?
Well, we're moving past just worrying about, say, arms sales or formal military treaties. Now it's about how a commercial investment in like a port terminal or even just a small stake in some AI startup could actually be used for strategic gain by another country.
Right.
I mean, for years, the U.S. worried about Israel selling military stuff to China. That was the big concern. But now the fear is flipped. It's about China buying what looks like harmless commercial tech from Israel, the startup nation tech, that might, down the line, actually help China's military.
That is a brilliant distinction. It really sets the stage for this very modern problem. Okay, let's unpack it. Let's start at the beginning, the economic drivers. Section 1, the honeymoon period. Why did Israel actively court China?
Well, the core reason, honestly, is pretty straightforward. Israel needed to diversify its economy badly. From the early 2010s, maybe even a bit before, but definitely locked in by 2013, the Israeli government saw it was maybe too reliant on its traditional friends in the West.
The U.S. and Europe.
Exactly. For exports, for an investment, the whole deal. And after the 2008 financial crisis, European markets weren't exactly booming. So suddenly, China, the world's fastest growing major economy, that looked incredibly attractive, almost irresistible, really.
And this wasn't just like companies deciding to trade more. This was official policy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The government was pushing this.
Oh, absolutely. There was Government Resolution 251 back in 2013. It wasn't subtle at all. It was a direct call to strengthen economic ties with China. They saw this huge untapped market and, frankly, a source of cash for big infrastructure projects that they just weren't getting elsewhere.
It feels very transactional.
It was, fundamentally. China had the capital, Israel had the needs. Simple as that on the surface.
But China wasn't just looking to build roads or buy oranges. Their interest, as you hinted, was technology. Israel, the startup nation, right? The famous Netanyahu quote from 2013 kind of sums it up.
It really does. After his visit to China, he said Beijing was interested in three things: Israeli technology, and Israeli technology. It just perfectly captures China's laser focus.
Pure tech hunger.
Exactly. For China, dealing with Israel wasn't really about standard trade in goods. It was strategic technology acquisition. They needed fuel for their own long-term national plans. They saw Israel as this unique source of really advanced civilian tech that could accelerate their modernization.
And this ties into their big industrial plan, Made in China 2025.
Directly. That plan is all about making China a dominant global player in, I think, 10 key high-tech sectors by the middle of the next decade. It's not just about making more stuff, it's about mastering the high-end strategic industries.
What specifically? Because Israel's strengths seem to match up perfectly.
Precisely the issue. We're talking new-gen IT, robotics, advanced medical tech, aerospace, and critically AI, artificial intelligence. Israel is a powerhouse in many of these. So China wasn't scouting for factories to build cheap goods. They were hunting for the patents, the IP, the know-how that would let them leapfrog their own development.
And the investment numbers show they put their money where their mouth was.
Oh, the scale was huge, and it happened fast. Chinese venture capital VC investment in Israeli tech basically doubled in just 2 years. It went from about $500 million in 2014 to $1 billion in 2016. And if you look at the period from, say, 2011 to 2018, the total investment was somewhere around $5.7 billion, just poured into Israeli tech. And you can imagine this created really powerful groups within Israel, business leaders, investors, who saw China as the future, made it much harder to argue for any kind of regulation later on.
Okay, let's widen the lens for a second. Beyond the tech, China also had geographic ambitions, right?
Yeah.
Israel's location mattered for their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
That's the other crucial layer here. Israel sits in a really strategic spot for China's 21st century maritime Silk Road, this huge global project to connect everything up.
Right, linking the Indian Ocean to the Med.
Exactly, through the Suez Canal. And Israel's ports, like Haifa and Ashdod, they're vital points along that sea lane, deep water access, transit hubs. So for China, investing in Israeli infrastructure, particularly the ports, it wasn't just commercial. It was a strategic play to secure their logistics, maybe reduce their reliance on choke points controlled by others.
So you have this perfect storm, really. Israel needs money and markets. China needs tech and strategic locations. Creates this honeymoon vibe. But we need to pause here. Because this whole issue of technology transfer between Israel and China causing problems, it's not new. There's a history here, a legacy of defense friction that honestly should have been a massive warning sign.
It absolutely should have been. I mean, yes, formal ties go way back, but the U.S.-Israel security relationship took major hits twice around the turn of the century because of defense sales to China. The first big one was the Falcon radar system back in 1999.
Right. Remind us what Falcon was and why the U.S. freaked out.
So Falcon was this really advanced airborne radar system, AEW&C. Think of it like a flying command post for an air force. It lets you see everything, coordinate everything over huge areas, a massive force multiplier.
And Israel was going to sell it to China's Air Force.
Yeah. The U.S. went ballistic, basically. They argued it had U.S. technology inside, and selling it to the PLA would completely upset the military balance in Asia. The pressure was immense. Israel had to cancel the deal, and it cost them, they had to pay China something like $350 million in penalties.
Ouch. And then just a few years later, 2005, the Harpy incident.
Yeah, Harpy. And that one might have been even worse for the trust between the U.S. and Israel because it involved, well, accusations of deception. Israel had sold Harpy drones to China before. These are UAVs designed to hunt and destroy enemy radar systems.
Loitering munitions, basically.
Kinda, yeah. So in 2005, China wanted them upgraded, maintained. The U.S. felt Israel wasn't upfront about what exactly that upgrade involved. The fallout was intense. For a while, the U.S. actually halted cooperation on really sensitive projects, even things related to the F-35 fighter jet program.
So these weren't minor disagreements. These were serious crises. And they led directly to Israel passing its export control law in 2007.
Right. They did. That law put really strict rules on selling weapons and explicitly dual-use technology, things clearly meant for military or civilian use. It drew a very clear red line. No more major defense systems to China. Period.
But here's the crucial pivot for today's discussion.
Exactly. The problem shifted. The worry wasn't about Israel selling tanks or radar systems anymore. It became about China buying seemingly commercial technology and investing in critical infrastructure, stuff that the 2007 law just wasn't designed to catch. That created the new vulnerability.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, the critical points of entanglement. This is where huge infrastructure projects like ports become security nightmares and tech investments reveal these deep vulnerabilities. And the poster child for this risk, as we said at the start, is the port of Haifa.
Absolutely. The Haifa Bayport Terminal, operated by SIPG Shanghai International Port Group, a Chinese state-owned giant. They won a 25-year tender, started operations in 2021. It immediately became this huge geopolitical flashpoint.
And why? Haifa. What makes that specific location so incredibly sensitive, both for Israel and for the U.S. Navy?
Well, first, it's Israel's biggest port, handles a massive amount of trade. But strategically, it's the home base for Israel's submarine fleet.
Which is widely assumed to be their nuclear deterrent.
Their second-strike capability, yes. So anything that could compromise security there is, frankly, existential for Israel. And then there's the U.S. angle. Haifa is a regular, crucial port of call for the U.S. Navy's Sixth Fleet. They use it for exercises, refueling, logistical support for things like ballistic missile defense operations in the Eastern Med.
Okay, so picture this. A Chinese state-owned company gets the keys to operate a terminal in this ultra-sensitive port for 25 years. What are the specific, concrete intelligence risks that have Washington and Israeli security folks losing sleep? What can SIPG actually see or do?
The concerns are layered. First, just having their personnel there, operating the terminal day in, day out, gives them incredible opportunities for intelligence gathering. Subtly, persistently. They can track the operational tempo of both Israeli subs and U.S. warships.
Like when they come and go, how long they stay, maintenance schedules.
Exactly. When are the subs in port? How often do sensitive U.S. ships visit? What kind of support do they need? Second, they can watch the movement of material. What's being loaded? What's being unloaded, the types of containers, the volume. That reveals a lot about military readiness and logistics chains.
But it's not just about watching ships and containers anymore, is it? The digital access is maybe even scarier.
That's the modern nightmare, yes. Operating the port means potential access to the industrial control systems, the ICS. These are the computer networks that actually run the port. They manage the cranes, automate the loading, schedule the ships, track the cargo.
So if you get into those systems,
you could potentially track specific strategic shipments in real time, maybe parts for Israeli fighter jets or components for missile defense systems. Even worse, you could theoretically disrupt operations, maybe even sabotage systems in a crisis. For the U.S. Navy, docking in Haifa assumes a secure environment. Chinese operational control shatters that assumption.
And this isn't just a Haifa problem. Ashdod Port, another major Israeli port, has similar issues.
It does. Another Chinese state-owned company, China Harbor Engineering Company, CHEC, built the new southern terminal there. And that terminal is located right next door to another important Israeli Navy base.
And CHEC isn't just any construction company. They've raised red flags elsewhere.
Right. CHEC has been involved in projects globally that blur the line between commercial and strategic or military. You look at Argentina, for instance.
What happened there?
Well, CHEC was involved in infrastructure projects, but the bigger story was this massive Chinese space tracking station built in Patagonia. It's run by a Chinese military-linked entity, leased for 50 years, and operates under Chinese law, not Argentine law. Many suspect it's primarily an intelligence collection facility. So that pattern feeds the concern. When these giant Chinese state firms invest in critical infrastructure overseas, is it ever just about business? Or is there always a strategic or intelligence angle baked in?
Okay, let's switch gears slightly from the physical ports to the technology itself. The pixels, maybe, instead of the ports. This whole problem of China acquiring sensitive tech driven by that Made in China 2025 ambition.
This is where that tricky definition of dual use becomes a huge problem. It used to be simpler, right? A widget could go in a car or a tank. Obvious dual use.
Yeah.
Today, it's about algorithms. An AI algorithm could optimize warehouse logistics, or it could manage a swarm of attack drones. Biotechnology could cure diseases or create bioweapons. It's incredibly difficult now to draw a clear line between purely commercial innovation and future military applications.
And Israel's existing regulations, the ones from 2007, they're based on that older, narrower definition of dual use. Why didn't that protect them?
Because it focused on things with obvious, explicit military potential. It completely missed the boat on these emerging technologies. The U.S., meanwhile, woke up to this earlier. They created FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act.
What does FIRMA do differently?
FIRMA specifically calls out fields like AI, robotics, biotech, advanced semiconductors as inherently sensitive, even if they're currently commercial. It assumes high dual-use potential from the get-go. Israel's rules just didn't have that category.
Yeah.
So Israeli tech startups became, easy pickings for Chinese state-backed VCs looking for exactly those technologies.
It almost sounds like Israel ended up inadvertently doing R&D for China's military, funded by Chinese money.
That's precisely the fear that gripped Washington. And look, it's not just theoretical. We know Chinese state-linked hackers have already targeted Israeli defense companies. They've gone after firms involved with Iron Dome, for example. The goal isn't just one piece of tech, it's systemic understanding the whole ecosystem.
And sometimes the acquisition isn't even hacking, it's investing in the very companies trying to stop the hacking.
It's pretty sophisticated, right? Why steal the tech if you can just invest in the company that makes it? Look at Alibaba investing in cybersecurity firms like Theteray.
What does Theteray do?
They specialize in detecting really advanced cyber threats, APTs, advanced persistent threats, the kind often launched by state actors. So an investment like that potentially gives Chinese entities insight into that array's technology, their intellectual property, maybe even their customer list, which could include sensitive government agencies or defense contractors.
So even a minority VC investment opens a window.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Alibaba.
No, VC funds themselves became a key channel. You had funds like Mizma, heavily invested in Israeli AI and cyber startups, which also took significant funding from Chinese VCs. This gives those Chinese investors indirect but really valuable visibility into the whole Israeli tech scene. They see who's doing what, which technologies are hot, who the best engineers are.
And maybe what the Israeli government itself is interested in buying down the road.
Exactly.
Wow.
That kind of access, even if indirect, is what really set off alarm bells in D.C. and led to this major U.S. intervention.
Perfect segue to Section 3, the U.S. intervention and Israel's regulatory wake-up call. Because the pressure from Washington wasn't subtle anymore. It got loud, direct, and very public.
Yeah, the Haifa port deal really crystallized the whole issue. It became the symbol. Suddenly you had U.S. naval experts, think tanks, intel folks openly saying the Chinese presence there created unique information collection capabilities, an unacceptable risk for the Sixth Fleet.
And the warnings went right to the top. We know President Trump apparently laid it out very bluntly to Netanyahu in 2019.
The report suggests it was basically an ultimatum. Limit your ties with China, especially in sensitive areas, or you risk damaging the fundamental U.S.-Israel security relationship, the bedrock of Israel's defense strategy.
That's huge.
It is. And Secretary of State Pompeo followed up with similar public warnings. He explicitly linked Chinese investments to potentially cutting back or even stopping the flow of vital intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Israel.
So the threat wasn't just about trade sanctions. It was about turning off the intel tap.
Precisely. The U.S. was saying effectively, look, if you let our main strategic competitors set up shop inside your critical infrastructure and sensitive tech sectors, we just can't share our most sensitive secrets with you anymore. It's too risky.
And the core U.S. fear wasn't necessarily that Israel would deliberately leak secrets. It was more about the unintended consequences, right? That tech, especially stuff with U.S. components or origins, would leak out through these investments and give China an edge.
That's it. The U.S. has its own export control system to protect its technological advantage. If China could just bypass all that by buying the tech or the company through an Israeli intermediary, the whole U.S. system breaks down. The risk was clearly seen as severe enough in Washington to actually jeopardize the security alliance. That tells you how seriously they took the strategic threat of these investments.
Okay, so Israel's under massive pressure from its most important ally. What did its internal regulatory system look like at this point? Could it even handle this?
Historically, no, not at all. Israel simply didn't have a dedicated body like the U.S. has with CFI-US, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, specifically designed to screen foreign investments for national security risks.
Explain CFI-US briefly, just so we understand the gap.
CFI-US is this powerful group. Involves Treasury, defense, state, commerce, all the key players. For certain deals, its review is mandatory. And crucially, CFI-US can force changes to a deal, lock it entirely, or even make a foreign company sell off a U.S. asset after the purchase if security risks emerge. It has real teeth, binding authority, focused squarely on national security. Israel had nothing like that. Their regulations were almost entirely about financial stuff, not espionage or tech leakage.
So no existing mechanism. This must have triggered a huge fight internally in Israel.
Oh, absolutely. A massive tug of war. On one side, you had the economic ministries, finance, treasury, plus the business community. They were terrified of scaring off Chinese investment. Billions were flowing in. They argued that any tough new regulations, what they called draconian rules, would kill the golden goose, stifle the startup nation vibe.
The economic argument.
Right. They basically said the economic damage from regulation would be worse than the potential security risks. But on the other side, you had the security people.
The NSC, Shin Bet, Ministry of Defense.
Exactly. They were pushing back hard, saying, wait a minute, these short-term economic gains are nothing compared to the long-term strategic cost of exposing our critical infrastructure and our best tech to a major rival power. For them, it was potentially an existential threat, especially remembering the Falcon and Harpy messes.
So late 2019, Israel finally creates something, an advisory committee on foreign investment. But it sounds like it was flawed from the start.
It was a compromise, and frankly, one that didn't make the security side very happy. First, it was set up by a caretaker government, so its political clout was limited. Second, and this is key, it was only advisory.
Meaning its recommendations weren't binding.
Correct. The politicians could just ignore the committee's security warnings if they felt the economic benefits were more important. But the biggest flaw, the real showstopper from Washington's perspective, was what the committee didn't cover.
Its mandate.
Yes. The committee was only allowed to look at investments in specific sectors. Finance, communications, infrastructure, transport, energy. What was missing?
The entire high-tech sector.
Exactly. The very areas AI, robotics, biotech, semiconductors that the U.S. was most worried about through its FIRMA rules and where China was focusing its investment efforts. Those sectors were explicitly excluded from the Israeli committee's review.
Why?
Because the economic ministries won that internal battle. They managed to shield the tech sector, the VC ecosystem, from security screening. It basically left the biggest vulnerability wide open.
That seems incredible. A security review committee that can't review the most sensitive technology sector. So it didn't really solve the problem the U.S. was raising.
Not the core tech transfer problem, no. It was seen by many as a measure designed more to appear to be doing something for Washington while protecting the domestic tech economy.
But have we seen any actual change in Israeli behavior since then? Any sign they're taking the U.S. concerns more seriously, despite the committee's limits?
Yes, definitely in the infrastructure area, where the risks are maybe more visible and politically easier to act on. The big signal was in 2022 with the privatization of the original Haifa Port Terminal, the older one, separate from the new one SIPG runs.
What happened there?
Israel awarded the contract not to a Chinese bidder, even though there were reportedly competitive Chinese bids, but to the Adani Group, a major conglomerate from India.
Choosing India over China.
Exactly. That decision sent a pretty clear message. It showed that the political thinking had shifted, at least for major strategic infrastructure. They prioritized alignment with a partner like India, which, remember, is also part of that ITU2 group, with Israel, the UAE, and the U.S. over potentially just getting the highest price from a Chinese company. It suggests a growing acceptance that security risks and strategic alignment now outweigh purely economic factors in these critical deals.
Okay, let's move to the final section, Section 4. This covers a really thorny issue for Israel. China's inherently contradictory Middle East policy. How can China be a reliable partner, even economically, when its broader foreign policy often clashes with Israel's fundamental interests?
It really can't be a reliable strategic partner, and that's the core problem. China's number one priority in the Middle East is stability, primarily driven by its massive need for energy resources from the region. To secure that energy, it needs good relationships with everyone.
Including Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel.
Yep.
They pursue this policy of sort of non-interference, which allows them to maintain ties with all sides simultaneously. But the consequence is that Beijing's official positions, especially in international bodies like the UN, frequently go directly against Israeli interests.
Like voting against Israel, opposing action on Iran.
Consistently. China almost always votes against Israel at the UN, and they've historically opposed any significant international pressure or military action targeting Iran's nuclear program. Plus, their relationship with Iran goes much deeper than just diplomacy. They have a formal, comprehensive strategic partnership, a CSP.
What does that CSP involve? It's a big deal. Long-term agreements on energy, yes, but also infrastructure investment and, crucially, security cooperation. China has sold weapons to Iran for years, and analysts widely agree they've provided significant help to Iran's ballistic missile programs and likely its nuclear efforts too, historically.
So China is actively strengthening Israel's main regional enemy.
While maybe stopping short of a formal military alliance, yes, the partnership provides Iran with economic lifelines, technological boosts, and diplomatic cover. This creates these incredible, almost absurd contradictions on the ground.
Like the same Chinese companies working on sensitive projects in both Israel and Iran.
It's genuinely remarkable. Take the China Railway Tunnel Group. This is a major Chinese state-owned construction giant. Right now, they're digging tunnels for the Tel Aviv light rail system. Part of that route passes very close to the Kiryat,
Israel's military headquarters complex.
Right, sensitive area. At the exact same time, that same Chinese company has a huge contract in Iran to build a high-speed rail line between Tehran and Isfahan, another strategically important link for Iran.
So a company potentially gaining geographic and structural insights near Israel's military nerve center is simultaneously building critical infrastructure for Iran.
You couldn't make it up.
Yeah.
And it happens in the tech sphere, too. Remember ZTE, the Chinese tech company?
Yes.
They invested in Israeli tech firms. But they also got caught violating U.S. sanctions by selling millions of dollars worth of surveillance gear stuff with U.S. components to Iran's state-controlled telecom company, helping Iran monitor its own population, essentially. So you have Chinese firms deep inside Israel's tech world while also directly equipping Israel's primary adversary. That's the definition of strategic conflict of interest.
Finally, let's talk about how the Israeli public views China. Because for a long time, Israelis seem much more positive about China than people in other Western countries.
That's true. Israeli public opinion towards China stayed positive much later than elsewhere. Support actually peaked around 66% in 2019. This was well after opinions in the US, Europe, Australia had started to sour, because of trade issues, human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong.
Why were Israelis different?
It seems to have been very pragmatic, very utilitarian, focused on the economic benefits. The money flowing in, the infrastructure projects, the tech investment.
And we have survey data showing that focus, right? Prioritizing economics over values.
We do. One survey found 57% of Israelis said advancing economic ties with China was more important than promoting human rights there.
Yeah.
It suggests a real focus on what's in it for us locally, perhaps a willingness to compartmentalize that you didn't see as much in other democracies.
But that tolerance, that pragmatic view, seems to have completely collapsed recently. The events after October 7th, 2023, changed everything.
Dramatically, it was a cliff dive. By July 2024, a survey showed Israeli support for China had plummeted to just 33%.
Wow, from 66% down to 33%.
A massive drop, and it's almost universally attributed to China's reaction to the conflict that started in October. Beijing was critical of Israel's actions. It blocked U.S. proposals at the UN Security Council that Israel favored, and perhaps the killer blow for Israeli public opinion, China publicly endorsed the Palestinian right to armed struggle.
That language would land very differently in Israel.
Absolutely. For most Israelis, especially Jewish Israelis, that kind of statement positioned China not as some neutral economic player, but as actively hostile, siding clearly with their adversaries, prioritizing ties with Iran and the Arab world. Any illusion of China being a potential strategic partner just evaporated.
So this huge shift in public opinion, piled on top of the relentless U.S. pressure, it really reshapes this whole U.S.-China-Israel triangle.
And if you bring it all back to that image we started with, the Chinese terminal at Haifa Port, you see the core dilemma. China fundamentally doesn't separate economics from politics from security. It's all one integrated national strategy.
But Israel, and maybe the West in general, tries to draw lines between them.
We try. But it's basically impossible to maintain that separation when you're dealing with powerful state-owned enterprises from a country like China, whose goals are inherently geopolitical. When the company running your most critical port is owned by a state that is also arming your main enemy and has global strategic ambitions that often conflict with yours, well, that line between just business and national security risk completely disappears. And Israel is still grappling, really, with how to manage that reality.
Which leaves us, it seems, with a pretty significant lingering vulnerability. I mean, yes, the U.S. warnings were loud and clear. Yes, Israel finally set up that advisory committee in 2019. But as you pointed out, its mandate is so narrow.
Still fundamentally flawed.
Right. It structurally ignores the entire high-tech sector, which suggests that the core vulnerability, all that sensitive civilian tech, the AI, the biotech, the stuff that could be weaponized or give a rival a critical edge tomorrow, that vulnerability remains largely exposed to a global power, China, whose interests in the Middle East often run directly counter to Israel's own security needs and those of its most vital ally, the United States.